Entrada Kelly and Jeannine Cook. I am going to allow the ladies to introduce themselves in their own way, and then I'm going to start off with some starter questions. A few things: you will be on mute while the ladies are speaking. If you have a question, please put them in the chat. After the first couple of starter questions, if I see some questions starting to come up, I'll start to call you out and say, hey, Donna, would you please state your question? So please get those questions in the chat. I will see them. So make sure it is saying to everyone. It has to say to everyone just so I can see it. You could send it to me privately too, but to everyone it will be fine. So let's get started. Erin, will you start off in introducing yourself, then Eileen, and then Jeannine?
Sure. So I'm Erin Entrada Kelly. I am best known for my middle grade fiction for readers 8 to 12 usually. And most of my books feature Filipino American characters, which, reflects my upbringing. And I would say a common thread in my books is a feeling of otherness. Sometimes it's otherness with relation to being first generation Filipino American. Sometimes it's otherness with regards to who they are as people. It's an issue that I really like to explore in my books. And I think that that's certainly one of the common threads that's woven throughout each of them.
I'm Eileen Gregorio, and I am a YA contemporary novelist, I guess you could say. My first novel, None of the Above, was actually pitched as Middlesex Meets Mean Girls. So my backstory is that I am a practicing urologist by day and YA avenging author by night. So you can insert your joke here. And my first novel was actually pretty deeply informed by a patient that I treated during residency who found out when she was 17 that she was born intersex, neither male nor female. And it's interesting when I wrote this, so I wrote this, None of the Above was actually my second novel. My first attempt at writing a book was a thinly veiled autobiography about an Asian American girl living in upstate New York. And it was obviously it was my first novel. It wasn't the best thing in the world, but it was enough to get me an agent. And when I did go out, my agent went out and this was of course at a time in publishing where there was it wasn't the best market because there was a lot of concern about ebooks, there was a contraction, but 3 separate Big 5 editors responded saying, oh, we love Eileen's voice and her writing, but this is too similar to another Asian American book on our list. And so that was a very formative experience for me as a writer. So when I wrote None of the Above, I'm like, okay, you're not going to have another intersex book on your list, number 1. But number 2, I actually whitewashed my book because of my previous experience. And I'm actually because of that, I became really involved in the We Need Diverse Books movement, which is a grassroots movement to try to increase the diversity of books and basically allow our books to mirror the population in America. And so to allow kids, no matter what their skin color, their ability, their sexuality or gender, can see themselves in books. And so I was really happy when I finally, after 5 years, finally wrote my second novel, This Is My Brain in Love. I was excited to be able to write what I call a happy book about mental illness, which features an Asian American main character, a Nigerian American main character, both who struggle with different aspects of mental illness, but who manage to find a happily ever after. Not to spoil it or anything. I think Jeannine's next. Great.
Hey all, hey y'all. I am Jeannine Cook. I am the shopkeeper at Harriets Bookshop over in Fishtown. And I have a short video, Yalonda, if that's okay for me to show. It does a great job of explaining who we are. Is that okay, Yalonda?
I think that would be an Alex question. Not sure if you can
Alex,
share your screen.
Yeah, give it a shot. You should be able to do it.
All right, let's see what happens.
If we want to see evolution, if we want to see this paradigm shift, we have to start being intentional about it. And I believe that starts with the word. I am Jeannine Cook. I am the proud new owner of Harriets Bookshop, which is a woman-owned, black woman-owned, young black woman-owned bookshop in the Fishtown section of Philadelphia. We're celebrating women authors and women artists and women activists. Coming into a space where you see brown and black children on the covers of books is not as common as it needs to be. You know, one woman walked by here the other day and was just like, is this bookshop for colored people only? And I was like, ma'am, what is a colored person? Tell me that, explain it, talk to me. And so that conversation, and those are the kind of conversations I need to be having, among others, just so that people can just work it out on your insides, that there is a place where there are lots of black people on the covers of books, and that's okay too, that's actually to be celebrated. At the heart of things, I'm a writer. I've been a writer since I was a little girl. When I was about 11, my mother went completely blind. She lost all her vision in both eyes. During that time, she was working on her master's degree in theology and continued to do it. And so what she would do is, there's 3 daughters, she would have us take turns either reading to her or typing up her words and thoughts. At 10, 11, you know, all of us learning how to type, learning how to like transcribe her words. We all would have to read these like deep theological books about the world. I was in an environment of words and books as a child, so it makes a lot of sense when my sister called me when I told her about the bookshop. She was like, this makes so much sense.
Yes. We want to just call out the names of those ancestors that have guided you, and that you hope would be in this space to help guide this space, that it truly is a space of love and liberation and peace for all of us. I'll say the first name, Harriet Tubman. Ashe. Ashe.
We're making an agreement as a community about what we want this place to be. We want it to be rooted in peace. We want it to be rooted in love. We want it to be rooted in respect, and that those are the agreements for the space. In the moment, you knew you were a part of history. You felt it. Everybody. It was just like, we're creating magic right now. I think people need a space to communicate, to connect. The way that Harriet's is set up, we keep an open space in the middle. That's intentional, so that people can communicate, so that people, you know, there's nowhere in here where you don't see who's in here and where other people don't see you. That's intentional, so that folks are seeing one another, like really, let's see one another.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeannine, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to share it. And I think it says so much more than I can say in this moment, and much more elegantly than I can. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Erin, Eileen, Jeannine, thank you so much for participating on this panel. Just in case we had a few people come in before, I'm Yalonda, I'm the moderator today. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat. You will be on mute throughout the questions. So once we see some questions coming into the chat, I will ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question to one of the panelists. So I'm going to get started for a few starter questions, just to get the juices flowing, and Erin, Eileen, Jeannine, you know, jump in on, you know, if you want to answer it or if you want to pass or however you want to do it. So I read a lot, of course, I'm a writer, I read a lot, and Toni Morrison is one of my favorite writers. She's one of my favorite people, actually, and God bless her and rest her soul. And one of my favorite quotes by her is, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So I really carry that a lot with me in my experiences and the things that I don't see on the shelves, and do I see myself on these shelves, and Is there anything that I can contribute in my writing to fix that? So question to you is, discuss this quote in response to how you approach your writing.
You know, I'll just jump in and say that when I was growing up and reading books, obviously the characters were always white. There were never any books, at least not that I came in contact with, that had immigrant parents or first generation stories. A lot of times the girls were blonde and blue eyed. And so, but you know, I think when you're a kid, you don't realize, I mean, obviously you realize that there's no books with characters who look like you, but you just assume that's because for whatever reason you don't deserve to appear in those books. You know what I mean? So you're just kind of like, okay, because also other medium is also telling you the same thing. It's telling you on TV, on billboards and movies that basically you're not important enough to exist in these mediums. So when I was a kid, I started writing when I was very young, you know, like 8 years old. And all my characters were blonde and blue-eyed girls. And, you know, they all lived in like middle-class suburbia, white America, whatever it may be, even though that didn't reflect my upbringing at all. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that, oh, wait, I can actually write stories about kids like me. You know, and I'm fortunate that I was able to come to that realization as an adult, and that the market was starting its slow shift. But for a long time, I just assumed, you know, people like me weren't worth writing about, so that's why they weren't being written about.
Yeah, my experience growing up was very similar to Erin's, and even when I did see people who kind of looked sort of like me, they were often very stereotyped, very one note. I mean, the most nuanced picture of an Asian American immigrant that I knew growing up was the year the born Jackie Robinson. And I remember being like, wow, this person looks like me. He has my same last name. It's so exciting. But at the same time, her story of someone who literally had just moved to the US and who grew up in a very urban area where there were other people who looked like her were so different than my experience was, because that's the thing that I think that I particularly didn't realize growing up, because there were so few such few evidence of Asian Americans in kids lit, is that we're not a monolith. There's so much diversity within diversity, and in many ways, a lot of the narratives surrounding Asians in media everywhere, you know, it really reinforced model minority myths, and didn't really give the nuance of the types of families that are within this diaspora, which is huge. I mean, my grandfather was born in South Africa. You know, my mother was from Taiwan. We were not the typical Asian American family, and I certainly wasn't the typical Asian kid. But in terms of wanting to write things that were not on the shelves, I mean, I think that was really intentional on my part for both of my books. The first one, because there is such a dearth of, I mean, half the people in this country, probably more, don't even really know what intersex is. That's a biological condition that a lot of people, possibly the girl next door, live with. And for This Is My Brain and Love in particular, I really wanted to show a book about mental illness, about anxiety and depression, that didn't have a clear attempt at death by suicide, because I feel like so much of the narrative surrounding depression and anxiety is really focused on, obviously, that most dramatic endpoint. And being the mother of a preteen right now, who I know is going through so much, I wanted to give her the vocabulary to be able to talk about what she's feeling, and to be able to see paths forward that don't end in that, but that don't focus on it, don't shy away from it, but that realizes that it's a huge spectrum. For so long in my life, I felt like I wasn't depressed enough to be able to seek treatment. You know what I mean? Like I wasn't a good enough depressed person because I wasn't actively suicidal. Whereas, you know, passive suicidality and a lot of the precursors to that are just as important to notice and be able to identify in people.
Thank you. Jeannine, do you have anything to add to that question?
You know, it's one of my favorite quotes by Tanti Tony, is what I call her.
You know, it's interesting because with that quote, there's a whole lot of responsibility that she calls on. And I think she's one of the most poignant writers I've ever come across, right? And what she's saying in that is that, you know, okay, you don't see it, so do it, right? And that doesn't have to necessarily, it could be about race, it could be about, you know, gender, or it could be about, but it's like, it could also be just about anything, because she's like, if you don't see a story that you'd like to see, go ahead and write it. And it's one of the things that I talk about with the bookstore. You don't see a bookstore that you'd like to see exist, then create it. If you don't see, and that goes across the line. Like, so we could start at books, because this is a conversation about writing, but it just keeps on moving, right? It keeps on moving into different areas of your life where you might not see something and you feel the calling for it to exist, and then need to take the step of making that happen. And then the other thing that I think about when I think about that quote is, in that video, I mentioned my mother and what it means to have been raised by a woman who's blind, right? Or who was actively going blind during our childhood and then went completely blind when I was around 11, 12. And so again, you'll see like this thread of these blind women in a lot of my stories, or in a lot of the, you know, things that I talk about, is these like this character that's moving through life with this other senseness. And so, you know, I think it's always interesting to me, these things that we've experienced in our lives and how we could use them as storytelling tools. And so, yeah, those two.
Great, thank you. I think it's interesting. I think, Eileen, you're the one that said something about your first book was whitewashed or something like that after response to what you wrote previously. And that really stuck with me, because I think in terms of, I've never had a book or anything published, but I think about mainstream publishing and the response to themes on diversity and equity. What are your experiences in publishing directly toward those themes? Is it something, I know now, I don't know if it's trendy, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's trendy right now, of course, to want titles like that, but
it's something that we've fought for a long time, you know, to be able to represent intersectional stories. So, and remember that there are different levels of racism. There's internal racism that authors feel, and that's certainly what I felt when I was doing that story. Because at that time, like in 2013, when I was starting to conceptualize that story, I said it in my high school growing up. But when I created my main character, who was intersex, like at that time, there was actually a dialogue surrounding reviews that would criticize books for being unrealistically diverse, right? Like Melinda Lowe actually went through reviews of books and picked out actual quotes by real reviewers like Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, where a lot of them criticized books for being too diverse because it felt forced or something like that, right? This is a known phenomenon. And so I very consciously made my main character a girl next door, you know, a white blonde girl next door, sort of as a Trojan horse, right? Kind of like Orange is the New Black, having Piper be the person bringing them into the prison system, where then they are exposed to like a lot of women of color, right? And so in that respect, that's why I created my main character the way I did. But because I said it in my own high school, I populated all of her friends with my friends growing up who were all white, right? All white and straight. And it wasn't until my editor actually came to me and was like, you know, you're the main character in the We Need Diverse books, shouldn't your book be more diverse? And I actually was able to diversify my supporting cast a bit, but it was something interesting. It was so interesting to see the levels of internalized racism that we carry as authors. And in terms of the publishing world, I do think that things have changed, Erin, like, right? Things have changed so much in the past 5 years because there's been such an active open dialogue because of it, because of the Black Lives Matter movement has like become so, you know, prominent. So I think that there's a lot more appetite for that, and, you know, people are a lot more intentional about it because we've been harping on it for a really long time. And certainly, like I said, and I think books are being published now that would have had a hard time getting support before. So things are getting better. They're not perfect, but they're getting better.
Erin, what has been your experiences around publishing and themes of diversity and equity?
You know, I think kind of what Eileen said, it's getting better. There's been certainly a lot of growing pains. I think one of the things that I've seen as an author is publishing is very white, middle class, women who went to top schools. It's very homogenous, the industry itself. And until that changes, I mean, I think what's happening now is how change always happens from the bottom up. It's readers and authors who are demanding and calling publishers out for their mistakes and their short-sightedness and, you know, whatever unintentional mistakes they're making. So it's kind of coming from the bottom up, but really the industry itself needs to change. It needs to be more inclusive of people from different backgrounds. It needs to be more open to remote workplaces for people who can't afford to live in a place like New York, which would then allow a lot of different people to work in publishing, because, you know, a lot of people who work in publishing have support, outside support that helps them survive on a publicist or an editor's low-level editor salary in New York. So I think that that's where the change ultimately has to be forced. Like we have to force their hand, because until that happens, you know, I think that one thing that people forget is that the gatekeepers, the agents and the editors respond to work that they respond to as a reader, right? As we all do. And if you haven't consciously opened your palette to experiences that are very different from your own, intentionally and consciously, you're going to keep selecting books that reflect what you respond to or what you grew up reading. And that just keeps perpetuating the issue. And I think one of the things that frustrated me is when the Black Lives Matter movement was happening, I saw all these publishers tweeting and Instagramming and support our Black authors. And I'm thinking, why weren't you tweeting and promoting these books before people were murdered? Like, why are you now doing it? And then it just feels it makes me feel very weird about that. You know what I mean? Because I'm like, what is your motivation here? Because it feels like you're using a movement to sell books. And whereas I didn't see you tweet one thing about any of these authors before. So, and I can't imagine what it feels like for authors on that side to be like, okay, you've been ignoring me for a year, but now you're tweeting my book. So there's a lot of things that need to change. And I think for real meaningful lasting change to happen, it has to happen within the industry itself.
Yeah, you know, Erin, and the funny thing about that is when we opened in February, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement has been underway for years now. And still folks told us that this idea made no sense, and that, you know, why would you open a bookshop with a mission of celebrating women authors, women artists, women activists? Like, who's going to shop there, right? And how could you compete with Amazon ever? And, you know, why are you in Fishtown and you're Black? You know, there's a million reasons why it was the worst idea. And then after George Floyd's murder, because he was murdered, and Breonna Taylor's murder, because she was murdered by folks who we continue to pay their salaries. After that happened, we saw this like huge influx of folks who were purchasing books that sat on our shelves for, you know, untouched for a minute. And, you know, there's the quagmire there, you know, which one, is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? But one thing I like is that we've been in a position to work directly with authors so that we can kind of cut out the middle person in some ways and say, okay, homie, you wrote this book, and we'll work together on how to get your book out in the streets, at least through our bookstore, at least for now. And so if those folks can't feel you, can't hear you, we can feel you, we can hear you. And that relationship has been, I think, really great for us and really great for a lot of indie authors and artists in our area.
Awesome. We're going to pause for a question from one of our attendees. Gabriel, you want to get off mute and share your question with the panelists?
Sure. Hi. And Eileen addressed it a little bit already, but it said really, I was just asking about the push for institutionalized diversity in publishing. It has to, at least in part, start with hiring more diverse staff, right?
Definitely. And that's kind of where I was coming from with for meaningful, lasting change to happen, it has to happen from the inside. And I think it will eventually happen, but only because the people at the bottom have been pushing it for it to happen, which is how change always happens, right? From the bottom up.
Right.
And the money issue is, and I almost feel like the pandemic might improve the situation a lot, because as Erin said, things are being done remotely. So this year, so We Need Diverse Books has an annual internship grant, which gives which gives money to interns who already have a job secured in publishing, and this is the first year they allowed it to go to people who are working remotely, and that who don't then have to pay to live in New York City on an intern salary. And it's going to be huge in opening doors. Again, not only just as not for editors, but also for all the other aspects within marketing, because an editor can acquire a book, but if a publisher's marketing team and sales reps don't embrace that book and get it into people's hands, that book is going to fail. And that has happened to so many books by people of color that I know, where they feel like they've been abandoned by, by their captains. And I mean, the thing that I think I was really buoyed We Need Diverse Books in the beginning was the support of teachers and librarians, because we talk a lot about gatekeepers. Obviously, booksellers are gatekeepers, and booksellers are a remarkably homogenous white group. If you go to an American Booksellers Association conference, and the same when you go to an ALA, American Library Association conference, or an NCTE, National Councils of Teachers of English, 80% of the people, at least in those environments, are probably going to be white women. And a lot of, I mean, there's so much baked into sort of the institution of like who we define as readers, that the fact that they brought so many teachers and librarians bought into this and like felt really, really engaged in it and have been really active in expanding their bookshelves in their classrooms and libraries, that was a really key thing. And so, I mean, I like to say that this is an all hands on deck situation, that everyone can make a difference. Parents are huge gatekeepers. That's why I love it when my friends, come to me and be like, what books should I get my kids? And I'm like, here's a very not so veiled way to be subversive to really just kind of plant things in their libraries.
Grishma, you have a question? You want to share it with the panelists?
Sure, it's more of a comment, and I just wanted some insight. So I've noticed in the last 2 months, as I go through Twitter and like manuscript wish lists, and everyone is like, oh, I want biopic, I want own voice, I want this, and it almost seems like a really quick reaction to the events of this summer. And I just wanted to get some insight from you guys who have been in the field for a long time on how authentic that is. Because I feel at the same time, I send my pages out and I get, well, I can't connect to this character, so I'm going to pass. Well, I'm like, it goes back to Gabrielle's question. Well, you can't connect to the character because there's just not that much diversity in the people reading this stuff. And, I've had people who are like my character read it or have this immigrant background, and they're like, oh my God, she's awesome, we love her. And then I'm getting reactions like, I can't connect to the character. And I'm like, well, how do I get past this? You're not going to be able to connect the character because I can't connect to Middle America and growing up in Idaho in the same way you're not going to be able to connect to, growing up at a motel while your parents ran it,
It is sort of the same issue, but there is a growing ranks of agents of color, and I can put some of their names in the chat so that you can reference them and consider submitting to them. I think that a little bit of it is a result of the summer, but Erin, if I'm not, this has been going on for years since We Need Diverse Books. Like there have been some really prominent agents who have started to speak out, and I feel like those manuscript wish lists have been, actively looking for own voices for at least 3 or 4 years. So it's been somewhat sustained, and like certainly, it's hard to know what the numbers are in terms of who is actually supported once those deals are made. But I'm hoping that it's more than just superficial. I'm going to write some lists.
Okay, yeah, I look forward to that list. Thank you.
I think we, maybe I'm being uncharacteristically optimistic here, but I think we may get to a point where, or I hope, I should say, I hope we get to a point where they don't have to ask for those things because it's just part of normal book submissions. In an ideal world, that's what it would be. Because again, if you have a diverse staff, if you have diverse agents, readers, editors, chances are they're not going to get a book and say, oh, this is an Asian book. We already have an Asian book on our list. Like, what does that even mean, right? I think one thing that I would say is the agents that you submit to, I would make sure that their clients actually reflect what they're saying that they want. And, obviously submitting to agents from marginalized backgrounds is good too. But, and see if they put their money where their mouth is, I guess you could say. But it is frustrating, right? Because you never know if they're not connecting to the character for what reason. And it's hard to tell because agents are intentionally vague often with their feedback, right? So it's difficult. But I think, or I hope that it'll just become part of the normal mainstream book market to have books that actually reflect what our society looks like. And then it won't have to be so intentional, if that makes sense.
It does. Jeannine, I'm curious to learn more about your experience as now a bookstore owner. Do you find difficulty in acquiring certain books? How do you promote local writers of color? How has that impacted your bookstore?
Yeah, so what we noticed after that surge of folks decided to start buying books that were specifically by Black authors, Black women authors, and started making that a part of their activism, was that the books didn't exist, right? So we couldn't even order them for it took like weeks for us to get things that, we typically could have had quickly, because what we realized is that they weren't even printing them at the magnitude that they needed to be printed, especially in relationship to the other book titles by, so-called mainstream authors, right? And so it was like everybody had to take a step back because they were like, oh wow, we weren't even printing these books. And so that was a good realization for folks, right? I think. And I think that the question someone asked about it being a trend, people, I'm asking myself that, right? Is this trendy? Is this the cool thing to do? And I think even, there goes my dog. That's cute. I mean, and I think, it hasn't been hard for me to acquire books. We have people coming to us consistently and almost constantly. And really it's about now figuring out how to, we have a very curated collection where we change our collection every month. We work with a different artist every month, and her and I reimagine what the bookstore should be based on her artwork and based on the themes that come up in her work. And so, we have a very small selection each month. And so then it becomes, okay, like who fits into that selection, who fits into the themes that we're talking about and sharing. But we do specialize and really have a lot of respect for first-time authors, right? Especially folks that are, you're coming out in the middle of a pandemic. There's it's very difficult for you to break in, as they say, and folks who are from Philly and tri-state, right? It's like, how do I make sure that Harriet's is a good representation of what people have to offer locally? And so, I think part of me is always like, if somebody don't want me, I go where I'm appreciated, not where I'm tolerated. And if somebody don't want me, I don't want them, right? And it's like, cool. And I think that what I've found in doing that is that I get myself into spaces where we are celebrated. I don't knock on doors of people who don't even like that. Oh, we don't understand. Oh, well, good. You know what I mean? Thank you for getting yourself out of my way, because I'm gonna align with the folks that are celebrating what I'm celebrating, and that's just how I've moved through the world.
And you know what, Jeannine's point made me think of another thing I want to mention. So she said that now you said there's books that you can acquire now because the books are there, and that's another issue that's happened in publishing that have hurt marginalized authors, because the way the system is set up to decide whether to acquire a book, what kind of advance you're going to offer, is to look at comparable titles that you can compare it to. And if you haven't been publishing diverse authors, then you go look at your comp titles and you're like, well, we don't have any. So then you try to figure out, well, how can I do these numbers to kind of support my argument if I'm going to acquire this book, or how much of an advance I'm going to give. But the books don't exist, so therefore they decide, oh, well, people don't read these kinds of books. Well, they don't read them because you have not published them, and you haven't published them because they don't read them, which doesn't really make any sense. And it has just kind of like continued this you know, unintentional oppression of certain voices because the books aren't there, and it does not really make any sense. So there's a lot of problems within the industry itself. But now that more books are being published from all different backgrounds, now that those books are there, hopefully that will further, you know, fuel the change that we need.
Agreed. Here's hoping, and that's not optimistic at all.
One question that people have been asking me a lot is about tokenism, right? And so, okay, now there's all of this desire to diversify. How do you make sure that you don't become somebody's like token, whatever, right? And how are you knocking down doors for a whole group so that you're not just the one and you represent the one? And a lot of times it's like, as long as somebody feels like they have the one, and then that one person is like, I'm good and I'm at the top and I don't want to shake and rattle my own boat. And so then, you know, we get the same like nonsense that where it's just like everybody has the one thing. And I'm like, that's just corny to me. But I don't go where I'm not appreciated. And so I don't, if it becomes like a thing where folks want to, you know, okay, there was a major credit card company who was like, Jeannine, we want to work with you. We want to work with you. Why? All of a sudden, why do you want to work with our bookstore so bad? Oh, we want to make sure that we're representing. And I'm just like, yeah, we're representing what and for whom, right? And how does that support my community in any way? And what have you done for my community besides try to, you know, tote me around and make me look like, you know, it's now okay to get this credit card. And I'm good. I'm good on that. And they were like, they were so shocked that somebody was saying no, right? And I was just like, yeah, this is not worth me selling out my folks. And that is important to me.
And I think kind of speaking on tokenism too, I get one question I get a lot from authors is, well, you know, I'm white, but I want to have diverse characters in my books. And how can I diversify my characters without being, you know, without stereotyping or without disrespecting the community and all this stuff? And how do you do it? And then it's a little perplexing of a question only because I'm writing characters that reflect the world that I live in. And I feel like if you in your life celebrate, I don't even know if celebrate's the right word, but if you in your life have diverse people, friends, I don't know, read diversely, then your work will reflect your reality because our lives inform how we write, right? So if you're sitting there and you have a diverse group of friends who you've loved and appreciated for years and years, you don't sit there and say, oh, there's Sylvia, my Asian friend. Oh, there's Susie, my Black friend. There's Joe, my gay friend. I mean, that's not how we should be walking around through life. So I kind of feel like if you're worried about, you know, tokenizing your characters or creating stereotypical characters, it makes me wonder if your life is not full enough with people from all different backgrounds. I don't know if that makes sense, but I kind of think, I don't sit there and say, okay, I'm going to create a Japanese character now, and she's going to have these traits. I just think of the character, and she may be Japanese, she may be whatever she may be, but it's just reflecting the world that I live in and walk around in. So it's like getting out of that idea of I'm me and then there's all these otherness people out there, whatever ability, orientation, race, whatever it may be, and just thinking of us all, okay, we're all like humans, we all have shared triumphs, joys, fears, loves, all that kind of stuff, you know, and not think of them as my Black character or my disabled character. I think that's where you run into a lot of problems, and not being willing to confront your own stereotypes and biases. I think that's another big thing that authors forget, because we all want to think that we're really progressive, great, open-minded people, but every single one of us has stereotypes, has prejudices, has biases, and unless you're willing to confront those in yourself, you'll never be able to create authentic characters.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was thinking of, if you have an audience in mind when you start writing, if that's at the forefront of your mind, or is it one of those things like you just mentioned, Erin, like I write a character, and if the character happens to be blank, then that character blank. Do you go into a project thinking, I have to make it this way? And another workshop I was in previous conference, they talked a lot about, well, if you're a Black writer, then you're expected to write all the time to Black characters. If you're an Asian writer, that's all they want to see from you. Like you are in a box in the publishing world. So when you talk about craft and writing, do you have an audience in mind, or is it more fluid, as you were saying personally, like when you start your projects?
So when I start my projects, it's always the same reader in mind, and it's always like the lonely kid who feels invisible and wants to be seen. That's my audience for every single one of my books. I'm thinking about that kid who was like me, who was sad, didn't know why, who felt othered, didn't know why, and felt like nobody saw me and that I was invisible. And then in turn, I wanted to become invisible. Like, don't pay attention to me, I'm not here. So that's the kid that I'm writing to, and that's honestly the only thing I take into account when I'm writing. That's my audience.
I've been writing a lot for my kids. You know, I mean, when I write this is My Brain in Love is definitely something that I wrote thinking, you know, I just need to create this story for my kids, a story of mixed, you know, people who are mixed race, people who are Asian, people who are struggling with mental illness. Because as you know, like Erin, for me, growing up, I was extremely lonely, and I felt very isolated and othered, and books were my best friends for a really long period of my life. And so now authors are my best friends, which is even cooler. But for none of the above, also, I honestly came up to the idea while I was pregnant, because I was thinking, okay, so if my daughter were to be intersex, you know, how would I deal with it? I feel like people read for different reasons, right? People read for escapism, people read to learn, and I really hope that people read my books to have conversations with their loved ones.
Like that. Do you have communities of writers that you associate with to promote, or to, because you know, after you've been published, sometimes, I don't know, do you stop? I know we have a lot of writing circles around, and we submit and we ask for opinions. And what do you have a diverse community of writers that you belong to that you can talk about to promote here with our attendees?
I think there are some really great, you know, affinity groups out there now. I mean, I know that the Black YA authors that I know, they like have an amazing support group. And this past spring for Asian American Pacific Heritage Month, Cat Show and a couple of other people created a big Asian American collaborative. And I know that there's for Latinx people, there's a collective called Las Musas, where they support each other's works, you know, blurb each other's books. I think that we all realize that we're stronger together, and that we have to lift each other up, and you know, just be there, because we understand the challenges and the barriers more than other people do. If you go to a conference, I don't know about you, Erin, but like the last time I've gone to any of these conferences, I just end up in a table or a room full of people of color. So.
True. And also, I will say this too, I'll give a shout out. Speaking of We Need Diverse Books, I am so proud to be a mentor. They have a mentorship program, and I encourage, if anyone out there has a manuscript that meets the guidelines, to apply. You know, obviously it's a mentorship program. So mentees are selected and matched with a mentor who helps guide them through their manuscripts. And I think that I also teach with Gotham Writers Workshop, and I know they're doing some things to kind of similar things. So those are also opportunities to look out for. It's not necessarily a writing group, obviously, but it is an opportunity to get your work in front of someone and actually get into the pages and really work on it.
Yeah, so I'm at Drexel's MFA program. I'm in the first cohort. And one of the things that I really like about Nomi, who runs it, I mean, when I first got in, I was like, I'm gonna need some Black people. I'm gonna need some, I'm gonna need this. I'm gonna need that. But I'm Jeannine. I am who I am. So I come in with, what's up with this? What's up with that? And so that's very helpful for me. I somehow learned how to self-advocate as a youngin. And one of the things I wanted to think about is just this idea of diversity, because sometimes I feel like once we say, okay, well, we have diversity in terms of skin or diversity in terms of like sexual orientation and that we really don't talk a lot about diversity of class, and that we talk, and so we think, okay, look at all these Black folks, right? But I think somebody who was raised in the projects or who lives in the projects right now is having a very different quote unquote Black experience than somebody who lives in Fishtown, right? Or somebody who, or Mount Airy, right? Like so we talk about this diversity in this way and don't address like one of the big elephants, which is like, there are a lot of folks that are beautiful writers who we're not even talking about them when we talk about what it means to have diversity. And so because there are people who kind of look like you and that resonates, that can mean nothing. That's just something to think about.
That is a huge dearth, I would say, especially in young adult literature, is no one's ever worried about money. No one's ever, I say no one, but there's very, very few books that I've read where families are concerned about money. It's like a non-issue. So I think we need more, socioeconomic diversity, but also I'm thinking about, and Eileen kind of mentioned this earlier, like able-bodiedness, like people who live with assistive technologies, all these kinds of things also fall under that issue of diversity. And I think it's important because there's a lot of kids out there. Of course, I was one of them who grew up and didn't have much money, but no one seems to be worried about money. No one's parents in the books are like, close the refrigerator door, the electricity bill's running up, or whatever. That just doesn't happen. But it definitely reflects a lot of realities that kids experience. And like one thing is, when I was growing up, I didn't think families ate dinner together. I thought that was something that happened on TV. So we even need books that reflect complicated family dynamics. And another thing that you don't see in a lot of young adult literature is religion, families that are religious or go to church or God is part of their lives. You don't see that either. And I think it's because, we're still not where we need to be with accepting and embracing all different kinds of diverse backgrounds.
That's a really great point on class. I think about that often, and how that relates even to my writing. Yeah, that's a really good point. We have about 9 minutes left here, and the panel, are there any questions from the audience that you might want to ask the panelists as it affects your writing right now? Do you have any works in progress that you want advice on, and how to promote diverse communities in anything that you're dealing with in publishing or in writing that you want to mention?
Well, while that's happening, I do want to give a shout out to Eileen, because I think it's important to show mental illness in minority communities, because I know that I was diagnosed with depression, chronic depression, when I was like 19. And I remember my mom saying, "Oh, we don't have that in the Philippines." Yeah, like, people aren't depressed there.
It's an American disease.
Yeah, like we're happy. We're fine with what we have. We don't have that. I remember that's her words. We don't have that. I'm thinking, okay, but when you're young, you're like, okay, I guess it is me, or I guess it's because I'm a spoiled American kid, or I guess it's because of this or that. But when the truth is, it's in all communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's not recognized in that community does not mean it's not there.
True. Same in my upbringing too. In the Black faith community, oh, you just need to go to church.
Yeah, you just need to pray it away. Yeah.
You'll be fine. You'll be fine once you go to church, and you'll feel much better. No, don't go to therapy. That's just a waste of money. Yeah, I grew up with that kind of ideology as well, which is more damaging than anything. So.
No, I mean, it's so, I know I've obviously struggled with mental illness myself, but I feel like I've had so many loved ones struggle with it and be so resistant to the idea of therapy, either because they think they don't need it, or again, they don't think they're depressed enough, or they just don't buy into it. And for a lot of people, it's the expense too. And so that lays bare, again, the issue of class. I mean, there are certain communities where it's inconceivable to like spend $150 on therapy, and there's so much to unpack about inequality and inequity in the world. Is your question?
Trish, you have a question?
Yes, so I was wondering if the panel could address writing about backgrounds that are different than your own.
I wanted to jump in just because we started with Toni Morrison and I know we're ending, so we can kind of bring her back around. But one of the things that I was listening to one of her lectures, and she talked about when she would get students into her classroom, she would say, yes, okay, everyone naturally wants to write about things that they've experienced. And she was just like, she would say, no, you can't write about anything you've experienced. You can't write about anything that you already know anything about. And you need to match very like a main character from a background that you have no access to, that you don't understand at all, with circumstance that you have no access to, and you have no knowledge of it at all, and push yourself into understanding, like push yourself into empathy and push yourself into places of research and so I always thought that was interesting coming from her. And then when you think about her book, I think it's Paradise, where she doesn't mention the race of the characters at all throughout the entire book. And this is Toni Morrison, who goes from The Bluest Eye, right, which is all about this little Black girl, to a book that is like, you have to figure it out or not figure it out, in reading about their backgrounds and like how to identify them based on your own ish. So I think that's an interesting thing coming from her.
Mm-hmm.
I also like to say that, people always say, write what you know. And like, I like to turn it on its head and say, I'm stealing this from someone. I think Elizabeth McCracken, know what you write, right? Like, obviously it's impossible to write about things that only you have experienced, because I mean, every single work of literature is going to have multiple points of view and multiple stories. And the art of being a writer is to be able to access thoughts and feelings and perspectives that you've not experienced. And sometimes that requires a ton of work, like to write None of the Above. I interviewed, dozens of intersex people. I read like pages and pages of their narrative. I spoke with them. I spoke with the parents. I spoke with, the kids, and I had them read it, because when you are trying to access the world of someone who's unrepresentative, it has to be a collaborative work. Like, they have to have say in what you write, in that they can point out things in their lived experience that you never would have thought of. And so I remember sending that book out to dozens of intersex men and women, and some of them gave feedback like that I implemented for second pass pages. So literally right before it went into press, like I was still getting feedback from them, because when you are writing about someone that's outside of your experience, you just have to have humility. And if you go in there with an open heart and open mind and know that you'll probably make some sort of mistake, just be willing to accept and learn from that, because that's the only way to grow as a writer and as a human being.
And I would say too, as far as write what you know, is I think it's important to write your emotional truth, because writing what you know often comes from what you feel. And at the end of the day, we all know what different feelings feel like. So for example, if I wanted to write a character who's trapped on the moon, well, obviously I've never been trapped on the moon, but I know what it feels like to be lonely and alone and scared. And I can pull from that resource. And I think, kind of to jump off Eileen's point, is where I really believe where authors get into trouble writing outside their community is not accepting what they don't know, and accepting that that they have blind spots in how they approach people and other people. So whenever I wrote Hello Universe, there's a character in there who's deaf and I'm hearing. And, I had to do a lot of research, which does not mean Google, what is it like to be deaf, right? It means like actually doing work and going out and finding people. But even more than that, it means asking questions that might make you look stupid or might make you look, that might make you look bad because if you don't ask those questions, you're never going to get the answer. And that's when people start to make mistakes. And that's where I think well-intentioned becomes problematic because, of course, I want to write a believable character, but I have to ask questions and I did. I asked questions that made me look stupid. But I had to, because you have to confront your own stereotypes. And as far as getting people to read it in the community, just to give a quick example of how important that is. In Hello Universe, I had a line in there that I was very proud of. And Valencia, the character who is deaf, she says, "My name is like a battle cry." That's what the sentence was. And when I gave it to readers, actually within the deaf community, their feedback was, a deaf girl would never think that because a battle cry is a auditory experience. And that's not something that would occur to them. Now, those are the kinds of nuances that get missed and get authors in trouble, rightfully so, because all of our existences are so nuanced, and you have to be able to pick up on that nuance to be able to write with respect to other communities. That's why it's so important to have sensitivity readers or readers from within the community so they can call you out. And when they call you out, be mature enough and humble enough to say, you know what? Because when we get called out, our first reaction is to be defensive instead of actually listening to what the person is saying. So humility plays a big role in that as well. Being able to say, you know what, I did kind of, screw that up, or that was not accurate. I think that's another big part of it as well.
Well, thank you so much. It is 3:30. Thank you, Erin, Eileen, Jeannine, for lending your very, very wise expertise to this panel today. It is much appreciated. I hope we all learned a little bit more about how we can promote diverse communities in our writing. So for the rest of the day, I hope you enjoy. We have 2 more sessions for Push to Publish today. 3:45 to 5, we have Meet the Agents. That's going on in Zoom Room 1. Carlos Spataro is the moderator there. So if you want to glean what our agents are looking for, please tune in. And we also have from 4 to 5 in Zoom Room number 2, Publishing Opportunities for Poets. So the conference still goes on. So if you're interested, please tune in to one of the Zoom rooms. And we thank you for joining us today. Have a good one.
And thanks, Yalonda, for moderating.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you, Yalonda.
There's such great questions.
Great, thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you, Alex.
Sure, thank you. I didn't do anything. Nothing of consequence anyway.
I think it went very well. I'm going to take another break and I think come back